Hello, SSE 826, and welcome to week 5. It's hard to believe that we're over halfway through this course at this point. And like we discussed in week 4, we have moved from the planning and risk assessment phase into that phase where we actually develop the plan. If we were looking at this on a course map. Today we're going to talk about response actions and two of the most fundamental response actions, evacuation and shelter in place. I want you to keep in mind that I'm approaching this from the safety director's standpoint, a safety director that works for a particular organization, and we're evacuating employees and those other people who are actually inside our facility or at a work site if it's a construction environment. That's the perspective that we're coming from during this instructional video. So we're going to focus on those two. That doesn't mean that these are the only two response actions. Obviously, if you work in a facility that has hazardous materials, you may provide your own response within that. And that's not evacuation. That's not shelter in place. Those are people who are trained, hazardous materials technicians, who, and also we have incident commanders and other folks who specialize in the hazmat response. That might be in a facility. Or you may have some other unique process or activity within a facility that requires an action besides evacuation or shelter in place. You may have an industrial fire brigade, and you've got certain personnel who are actually fighting the fire if that's the emergency or the incident that's taking place. So there are other response actions that could take place during an emergency situation. So by no means do I mean to convey that this lecture, this instructional video, covers the whole world of emergency responses. It doesn't. It covers two of the most fundamental actions we're going to take a look at. And the reason they're the most fundamental, the ones we're going to focus on, is because they are probably the most effective, and they reduce risk the most when we talk about impact on people. Obviously, environment, continuation of business, property protection will many times encompass other emergency actions, but we're going to talk in particular about evacuation, shelter in place, because they're the most fundamental, they're the most common, and they provide the greatest protection to people if done correctly. So that leads me to my next point. I want to impress upon you that week 5 instructional video is not meant to be a guide, a step-by-step guide. There's enough literature out there, certainly in the assigned reading for this week, that lays out more of the step-by-step basic considerations for developing evacuation and shelter in place. I really want to focus in this instructional video on some best practices and things that you should consider that's not pervasive throughout the literature on evacuation and shelter in place. I want to focus your attention on things that you should consider as you develop an evacuation and shelter in place plan, that things that are beyond what OSHA might prescribe, not necessarily in a regulation, but in a supplemental small business or employer's guide, or even beyond what you would see in a consensus standard like NFPA 1600. These are really practical considerations and best practices that come from experience, both from my own, both from reading and studying about other industrial worksite type emergency incidents, and things where maybe there was an evacuation process in place, a shelter in place procedure in place, yet those procedures failed or they had lackluster performance during an incident. So we're going to focus on some of those things that would prevent that from happening in this instructional video, or at least minimize it. So with that, let's go ahead and move into it. I love quotes, and this is one of my favorites from Yogi Berra. It says, you got to be very careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. Evacuation, shelter in place, certainly is no exception. If we don't have a well-developed evacuation, shelter-in-place procedure, it could prove disastrous, or if certainly not fatal, for some of the folks that those procedures are designed to protect. So we have to be very careful as we develop evacuation procedures. And by evacuation procedures, I don't mean just a drawing. I mean a purposeful strategy that takes people from a particular location and moves them into an area of safety. We have to be very careful in developing procedures for that, not just the route on how to get from point A to point B. So I hope you find the Yogi Berra quote instructive. If not, I hope you get some of the comic value in it. Yogi is certainly one of my favorite source of quotes. I want to tell you about some of the kind of the steps or the timeline for evacuation or shelter in place, because I think this timeline is important for us to consider. It helps us look at the big picture when we talk about evacuation or shelter in place. And it's all the way from detection to reentry or further evacuation. Obviously, the first step in any type of evacuation or shelter in place is detecting the emergency or the incident to begin with. And what we're going to do is break down each of these steps during this presentation. But we have to think about detection. Then we also have to think about notification or alarm. How are our employees, how are contractors, how are visitors, how are the various stakeholders going to be aware that an emergency incident is underway and that they need to take an action either to shelter in place or evacuate? We have to carefully think about how we get the word out to the people and evaluate its efficacy. Once we've notified people that the incident is underway, that should prompt the evacuation or the shelter in place. And obviously, that requires a lot of careful thought and varies greatly from facility to facility, industry to industry. Once we have employees evacuated, it's imperative that we account for those people. Without accountability, we don't have the assurance that the whole purpose, the objective of evacuation has been accomplished, because we've left visitors, contractors, other stakeholders in a zone of danger. Then that would prompt some type of rescue operation. So accountability is critical to make sure that everybody is where they're supposed to be. And I'm going to say it now, I'm going to say it again whenever we get to the accountability slide, that accountability should not be just a mere head count. I realize that is pervasive in the literature, it's pervasive as a practice in industry. Countless emergency action plans for an organization, plans that I have reviewed, I've found that just simple language will perform a head count. And many times a head count is not necessarily sufficient. So we have to have accountability. If everyone is not accounted for, that would prompt some type of rescue, some type of recovery operation, whether it be an outside emergency agency such as a fire department or rescue team having to go into the zone of danger to try to find somebody and get them out. We have to have that set in place, and normally this is going to be prompted through the incident command. Which is why we talked about that in week 4 and not now. So there is some strategy in how we put this together. And then hopefully we don't have to do a rescue operation, and we really just skip from the accountability down to the last step, and that is the reentry procedure or evacuation. Now, sometimes it may be a situation where once we have evacuated, employees or stakeholders are actually dismissed from the scene. That's quite common. I remember a plant that I had that I was in charge of whenever I was in industry. We actually had a fire develop there. Unfortunately, this fire happened on a day that we were having a national sales conference at the facility. And as buses, charter buses were rolling in with sales staff from the larger parent company, we were evacuating the facility, and we had people at rally points. What had happened was we had a small fire in a welding booth. Employees acted as they were supposed to in pulling the fire alarm and evacuating the facility. That worked well, and we were able to get back online fully in production within 45 minutes after the alarm sounded, which was a fantastic recovery operation. But we had folks in rally points until we had an all clear and it was safe to go in. And really that all clear wasn't issued until we had all the water cleaned up, we had fire hoses back up, and then we had inspected the area, all the systems around it to make sure they were safe. It wasn't just get back in here after the fire was out. particularly for the folks working in those areas. There were other areas of the plant we were able to resume operations even before the cleanup was done there. But reentry, we need to make sure that we have thought about what will trigger reentry, what makes reentry possible. When can the incident commander order reentry? What conditions precedent must be met in order for, before even the incident commander orders reentry? Hopefully this is not the case, but sometimes situations could develop that were unanticipated, and we may have to move the rally points, or we may have to evacuate even from an assembly area. So we got to think about all those things. We have to think about this as a continuum, as a timeline when we prepare and think about evacuation or shelter in place. So with that, let's break these steps down and talk about some best practices as we go through these. But first, I want to give you just kind of some overall broad considerations as you develop all of these steps in your evacuation or shelter in place elements. First, you need to prescribe what the default response for various emergencies will be. For instance, for fire, most of the time the prescribed default response is to evacuate a facility. Now, you may have designated fire brigade or folks within a facility that serve in a response role besides evacuation, but for those other individuals, their default response is likely going to be to evacuate the facility. If the emergency is a tornado, usually the default response is to shelter in place. So that's what I mean by prescribe the default responses for various emergencies. It's usually not going to be a separate evacuation plan for fire versus some other type of emergency that warrants evacuation. You really want to have consistency and probably one developed emergency or, evacuation procedure. Now, I realize there are sometimes unusual circumstances, unique operations that might warrant different types of evacuations, or they might probably more commonly have a separate evacuation assembly area. However, the procedure and process should be consistent no matter what the emergency is. So once we prescribe a default response, everybody knows what to do. If it's fire, we evacuate and we follow our standard evacuation procedure. I hope that makes sense, and I think that will go a long way in helping your plan if you have very consistent, refined evacuation or shelter-in-place procedures that can be used for the appropriate emergencies. Customize goes along with the next point: adapt, don't adopt. In emergency action planning, just like any safety program that we're developing, many times we clamor for the template or the recipe or the silver bullet that I can just fill in the blanks and and be done. And it's just not that way. If you want a quality EAP, you want one that's effective when the emergency really occurs. It really has to be developed with your facility in mind. I can't stress this enough. It's no different in what element we're talking about of your EAP. You have to customize. You have to adapt, don't adopt. Consider the behavioral and cultural factors in your organization as you develop this. The assigned reading for this week discussed some of the common myths associated with panic behavior. Don't just presume you understand how people will behave in an emergency. Many times people think everybody panics and it's crazy and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's why we just tell people to evacuate in an orderly fashion and walk, don't run. Those are common things. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea to tell people to evacuate in an orderly fashion. Obviously, they need to do it in an orderly fashion. But we need to purposefully and strategically consider how people might behave. And particularly when we talk about the evaluation of our system, we need to consciously watch, observe how people evacuate during testing and drills so that we will be better prepared and to make adjustments to our plan and continuously improve it. A lot of those evacuation shelter-in-place improvements come through observing behaviors and understanding some of the cultural factors in the organization. You need to make sure you evaluate the safety of two particular areas, obviously more, but these two are critical. The evacuation route. I don't know how many times I've seen organizations have an evacuation route, and in that route, during particular type of emergency situation could likely become unsafe, particularly if there are piping or various processes that are connected to one another. Maybe it's an explosion or fire. This particular evacuation route, while it may be the shortest, may be also the most unsafe. So that's a balance. It's really difficult to say, we always take the safest route. Well, the safest route may not be a timely route, and obviously time, we have to worry about that as well. The assembly area rally point, you have to think about the safety of that location. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but what I'm thinking and trying to convey is, how our emergency response vehicle is going to get to the facility. Do you have a rally point in an area that's going to cause evacuees to cross traffic and risk potentially getting struck by an emergency response vehicle? Or is the rally point at a safe distance from the facility, depending on the type of emergency? I remember taking a look at an emergency action plan that was developed for a rubber facility. They had employees evacuating a particular aspect of this plant where some of the rubber was produced, and it was fenced around this particular area of the plant, and the fence was fairly close to the facility. Well, if you looked at the amount of heat and smoke that would be produced if that particular building was fully involved in a fire, you would have people trapped in a particular assembly or safe area. So it had to make some provisions for that. It involved cutting the fence and creating a gate to get out to another area, but those are the things we got to think about when we evaluate safety. Accountability, accuracy is a must. Repeating myself, but one of the reasons I am is because it's very important. We have to account for people, and usually just a mere head count's not enough. And we can't forget about people like contractors, visitors, or other stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean people who would be impacted by the emergency, and also those in the facility with disabilities as we think about evacuation. So those are some broad general considerations as we go through. Let's talk about some things that are more specific. We have to evaluate how the incident or emergency is going to be detected. We have to consider that. Obviously, the most common way that emergency incidents are usually detected are by people. We have tremendous technology with fire detection and alarm systems. We have tremendous gas and hazmat sensors and systems that are designed to detect when a leak occurs or when we have a hazardous atmosphere. But by far, the human element is always at play. So at this point, when we consider that, we know we need to have a robust system that we train employees on if they detect the emergency situation, what their action. If they detect a fire, is it to go straight to a pull station? And by pull station, for those of you who may not have a fire background, I'm talking about the things on the wall that you actually grab and pull down in the event of a fire. It sets off the fire alarm, which usually is a signal. That's the notification part for people to evacuate the building. But it's not always a fire alarm. It may be reporting it to security. It may be picking up a phone and dialing an emergency number within a facility. So we have to think carefully about how employees or passerbys might detect the emergency and train them on what their actions are in providing the necessary step to notify people of the situation. Obviously, a fire detection system, a fire alarm system within your facility. This might be heat detectors. It might be smoke detectors that within the facility. It might be pull stations. Those are all examples of some type of fire detection means. Obviously, the fire alarm involves or pull station involves an employee. But the other stuff is fairly automatic. We have smoke detectors that might be monitoring the air in the facility, or obviously it's photoelectric. It's evaluating light and things in a particular area. But we may also have detectors within the HVAC system within a facility. Those are all designed to automatically detect the presence of smoke. We might have heat detectors, obviously. We need to map those out. We need to do a thorough assessment of what we have in the means of fire detection so that we can properly plan on telling people what to do when they are notified. Hazardous material, hazardous atmosphere detection, there are obviously thousands of sensors out there, or maybe not thousands of sensors, but systems out there that employ a variety of sensors that usually are designed to detect a particular hazardous substance or a particular hazardous atmosphere. And then we'll see those either provide a local notification, or they might provide a facility-wide or even community-wide notification. Weather detection and monitoring, obviously the basic, most fundamental thing here is having a weather radio. You'd be surprised at the number of facilities that don't have a weather radio. But the thing is, it's not enough just to have the radio. We have to have somebody monitoring that radio, or some type of something that would trigger the monitoring of it whenever there's even a chance that we're going to have some severe weather. So that's kind of a basic fundamental, and really these things don't have to be, it's not one or the other on these three items on the weather detection. For some organizations, it's all three. Now, we can become more complex with how we detect weather-related emergencies. We may have fixed-base weather stations at a facility. I find that folks, particularly that have hazardous materials in a facility, and always, very concerned about wind direction. Should we have a leak or should we have a release? They really like to know lots of things about the atmospheric conditions that are surrounding them. But these fixed-base weather stations can also alert a facility, sometimes in a more detailed and in a more urgent fashion than a traditional weather radio would. That's obviously tied to the National Weather Service. This allows the facility to get data and make some own determinations, but they also get the same warnings that you might get through just a normal weather radio. Those are obviously more expensive, and it's a larger investment to have that. And obviously, usually you have to have a need for that, unless you've just got a lot of extra capital cash and you would like to get one. That would be fantastic. Again, think about who's going to be monitoring it as you go and press for that capital expense. Now, if you have folks that are out and about, maybe they're working in remote areas, they may not have a weather radio in a truck, what have you. They rely on a local AM or FM station. Vehicle weather stations, vehicle weather alert systems are available, and it's something you may want to consider. Now, obviously, technology has come a long way. It's certainly outpaced the literature on emergency action and planning. We can't keep up in the literature reviews or the body of literature, because the apps for smartphones and for tablets and other devices many times are being developed on a daily, monthly type basis, so it's almost impossible to keep up. But keep in mind, there are lots of apps and other things that people in the field, even people at a fixed location, can install on their phone. Minimally, those things that are free from local weather stations, television stations. If you don't have anything else, have those installed. But always check the credibility and the utility of those before putting all your eggs in those baskets. And then finally, no matter what it is, whether it's a fire alarm, a hazardous material detection system, weather monitoring devices, you have to think about who's going to be monitoring that and what notification capabilities those things have. If you want to make sure that if you have a weather radio, somebody's listening to it. If a fire alarm drops and you need to evacuate the whole facility, is there somebody monitoring a panel or an annunciator panel that tells us where a fire alarm is, and so that somebody can get on a radio or send a message somehow within the facility to evacuate the whole facility. So you got to think about that whole picture as we talk about detection. Notification. This is the component where we're sending the message out to the stakeholders, the employees, visitors, contractors. This is how we alert them that these situations going on. And obviously, I've discussed some of this. Fire alarm systems we've already talked about. Usually, it's going to be an audible and visual system. Not every facility is equipped with a fire alarm. I know that might seem surprising to some of you who maybe worked in facilities like hospitals your career, or large manufacturing operations. There are older manufacturers and other types of occupancies that still don't have fire alarm systems, and we have to figure out ways to notify people when we don't have it. Facility public address system. Most of the more complex or sophisticated fire alarm systems that you're going to see in medium to larger manufacturers have one of these built in. There's a capability for someone to get into a panel. Usually there's a CB microphone or something like that, and they can come over the speakers that would be used to notify people of a fire alarm and convey a message to people. One of the things I've ran into personally is utilizing that public address in certain areas of our facility because of the ambient noise, and we had many hearing conservation areas. Even if you're on the public address system, you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. So you have to think about, can the people hear the message? Is it audible, and is it understandable? The hazardous material atmospheric alarms. Sometimes we might see those as a local alarm. We may have a room that stores particular hazardous material, and there's a sensor inside monitoring for the leak, and the sensor simply sends a message to some type of receiver or processor on a wall that there's a red light and a horn, and it just sounds off in that local area. Obviously, you'd have to look at your material and what a leak would mean and see, do we need a more sophisticated alarm? Do we need something that is more robust? So we'd have to look at the particular material. I've seen this a lot in wastewater treatment facilities or water treatment facilities that might be remote, where they're maybe storing chlorine gas or sulfur dioxide gas, and they have rooms where compressed gas is stored, and they want to monitor if there's a leak. And many times there's a light and an audible alarm, and it's just linked to that building. Maybe that's sufficient in some cases, maybe not. You have to look at your situation and determine. That ties in closely to the next bullet, whether we have a local versus a facility-wide versus a community. Again, this is determined by the level of risk, but we want to make sure we assess the notification system. If we need to have a facility-wide evacuation, obviously just a local alarm without some type of procedure in place to make sure the whole facility knows won't cut it. And the same goes for community-wide. We have to think this through and spell out a procedure that would fit our needs. When we talk about notification, obviously it's usually by sound or through sight. Audible ones, we need to make sure it's heard by those who are affected. They need to be able to hear it. Like I said, if you've got a message that has to go across, don't want it to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. And then also I have to think about folks who are hearing impaired. What are we going to have for them? Many times, like I said, modern fire alarm systems, they also have flashing strobes, which, largely a product of needing to address the needs of those who might have hearing impairments. But it also serves a purpose to those who don't have hearing impairments. And if we're going to rely on something like that, we need to make sure it is visible to all those affected. We have a red flashing light is in an area to where you can't tell if the red's on or not. Obviously, sunlight and other things can come into play, and a visual alarm, you can't see it because of glare and other things. Like I said, if you're relying on a visual alarm, you've got to have something that's an alternative for those who might be visually impaired. You need to have distinct notifications for specific emergencies. One fire alarm, if you only have one tone, for example, and employees hear it, they might presume that's a fire, I evacuate. But if you're really using it for a tornado, probably evacuation is not the right thing. Well, there's no probably it's not the right thing. Shelter in place, particularly in the settings that we're working in, is a safer option. And the employees need to be able to distinguish the different audible alarms. So different tones mean different things. This has to be covered in training, and we need to make sure that we have distinct notifications for very specific emergencies. Finally, the notification part is probably the best place for us to discuss having a clear authority on who can issue evacuation orders. Because once the evacuation order is issued, evacuation should take place. Now, if it's common that an employee who sees a fire or a passerby in the facility sees a fire and they pull the fire alarm, they've obviously exercised the authority to signal the alarm to make the notification. But it's many times not that simple when we're talking about something such as a tornado. We need to have, as clear as possible without making it too complex or backing ourselves in the corner too much, but clear authority and clear conditions precedent to issue an evacuation order. For example, some facilities will say, when there is a tornado warning for the immediate area, we will go ahead and shelter in place at that point. When that's been pre-established and everybody's agreed on it, we don't have people wondering, well, should I issue the alarm or should I not? So this will help take care of that. Evacuation. Again, we have to have prescribed emergencies. What emergencies warrant evacuation? We need to have procedures. Is there procedures for shutting down particular equipment? I mean, there are some equipment that in an evacuation, a simple turning off or pulling a disconnect lever would go a long way in mitigating loss to the facility or creating further disaster, and it wouldn't impact the safety of the individual evacuating. So we need to consider that. Do we have equipment that people could do critical shutdown very quickly and then still evacuate? Now, this is different from the people who may remain in the facility initially to do a critical shutdown, and you'll see OSHA has provisions for that in the standard. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who aren't going to be staying in the facility, but they're actually going to be evacuees. But this is a simple step where pulling a particular disconnect will go a long way. Need to have specific organizational steps for evacuating. And then we need to have clearly defined routes for evacuating. We need to make sure that there's clear routes to actually get out of the facility, that these routes don't necessarily take us through unnecessary risk, and everybody knows the route to take. And we need to make sure that these routes, like I said, get us in a timely, expeditious means to an assembly area. It's a great idea to have posted evacuation diagrams. We don't always have to require those, but having a posted evacuation diagram certainly goes a long way. And then we need to have clearly designated assembly areas. Some facilities will put a sign that says this is rally point 1, this is assembly area A, and everybody knows if I work in this area, I go to assembly area A, or rally point 1. That needs to be determined and set forth. Now, maybe it's painting something on the pavement outside, or maybe it's posting a sign. But you need to make sure you designate those assembly areas. And like I said, making sure we have safe routes and safe assembly areas, routes and assembly areas that are as free from response vehicle traffic as possible, and they're not too close to a potential incident. Shelter in place. Again, we need to make sure the environment where we're sheltering is safe and suitable for the particular emergency. We don't want to shelter in place on an exterior wall that's full of glass. We want to make sure that it's suitable for the particular shelter in place purpose. And if it's from a hazmat situation, does it provide the least amount of we want to also make sure that the shelter-in-place area has the capacity to hold the amount of evacuees or shelter-in-place individuals that we're planning for. Many times we make the assumption that a bathroom or a locker room will be a shelter-in-place location. It's not until we actually shelter in place that we see that it's much too small. So we need to make sure it has the capacity to hold the individuals that will be in there. Communications, we need to make sure that we have some form of communication, communication within the facility with the incident command system that would be operational during a shelter-in-place scenario, and then also communications with the outside world. How are we going to monitor conditions, particularly if it's a weather scenario that's prompted a shelter-in-place? We need to think and plan and have procedures for the communication during a shelter-in-place. If we're sheltering in place because of some type of hazardous atmosphere, hazardous materials leak, release, we need to make sure that we're able to shut down the HVAC system, particularly for that area that we're sheltering in place to. There should be procedures for that, and we should evaluate that well ahead of time and make sure that it is suitable for that. And then we need to have clear procedures and authorities for when we will allow folks to leave the shelter-in-place area and re-enter the facility, or if there's been damage, or worse yet, there's a more of a community, larger scale situation. How might we, leave out of the shelter-in-place area, and when will we know that it's okay to do that? Accountability, I've discussed this already. I'm going to reiterate a few other things because it's very important. Merely a simple head count probably won't cut it. Give me names. You've often heard that. I want names. Many times, it's some type of accountability roster, whether it's an employee attendance sheet, maybe supervisors, team leaders, what have you, keep a running list each day of who is there, who's leaving early. Maybe there's some type of time clock printout system, or maybe even now, with smartphones and tablets, the ability to pull data from an attendance system or a time clock system, so that we can actually compare who's in an evacuation area versus who's left for the day or who came in late. There's a balance in accountability systems. We don't want it so complex and trying to account for individuals that we can't timely find out if there's someone we need to rescue. But at the same time, we don't want to just count heads and say, yeah, this many are here and this is how many we should have. Because head counts invariably are just a number, and that number may not accurately reflect somebody who came in late for the day. Maybe we had 2 employees come in late and another employee left early. Then we might, arrive at a one way or the other on a mere head count, and there's a lot of room for error. So having names is much better. You need to make sure that visitors and contractors are also part of the accountability system. Keeping a contractor sign-in sheet that would be gathered and taken out in the event of evacuation is extremely important. Also a visitor log. And the contractors and visitors should have some type of orientation. Obviously, most companies will have a contractor safety orientation, which covers more than just emergency action planning, where that is discussed. But for those who are visitors, minimally some type of brief orientation that tells them what do they do when they hear a particular alarm, where do they go, and how are they accounted for. And then some type of a visitor log that will be compared once we evacuate and arrive in an assembly area. And then we need to also make sure there's a procedure and means for leaders in the various assembly areas to communicate with incident command, almost a sound off, if you will, indicating that their particular assembly or rally point has indeed accounted for all the individuals that should be in that area. So you need to think about procedure. You need to also think about personnel. Who's going to do this? Who's in charge of communicating this to the incident command? And then the equipment. Is it going to be two-way radios or some other form of communication? And making sure that you button that up and you spelled that out. So that's the accountability portion of that. Moving on here, re-entry. Like I said, spelling out what are the conditions precedent, what will allow re-entry, what must be satisfied, what must be met in order for us to re-enter the facility. And who has that authority? Usually that's going to be something coordinated with the incident command, if not the incident commander themselves. Also think about traffic, how we're going to re-enter the facility, what locations, doors, making sure that it's safe for pedestrians. And then also if there's any type of vehicular re-entry, we think about that as well. Again, we think about equipment, processes for restart procedures. Once they've re-entered the facility, when is it safe to energize the machinery they're working on, the process that they were in the process of doing whenever they left? What are the key things that must be inspected on that, should be thought of? Now, that may not be something you integrate into the plan, but it's maybe it's machine specific that has some type of emergency restoration procedure that says here are the safe requirements for that. Now, one of the things I haven't discussed in this is the availability of your emergency action plan once you've evacuated or once you're in a shelter-in-place facility. You're going to need some access to your emergency action plan once you've made the evacuation, once you have arrived in an assembly area, once you're sheltered in place. It's a good idea to be able to access this plan. And if everybody just evacuates and it's just a paper copy, big, voluminous manual on a shelf, it might not prove helpful. Lots of organizations and even community emergency response have a cold book, hot book type arrangement. Cold book meaning it's more of the comprehensive plan. It contains all the detailed information, whereas Hotbook is more like the checklist, if you will, or the down and dirty critical procedures, the critical things that has to take place during an emergency situation. It would also include emergency contact information, phone numbers, what have you. So you need to think about that. I didn't have a particular slide on that because it's so varied, but it is something you should consider in your emergency action plan. And by the way, what you're developing for this class is more of a cold book. It's more the comprehensive plan, but you could certainly reference and discuss a hot book approach, if you will. Now, I'm going to encourage you to look at the technology that's there. There are a lot of apps out there that allow companies to upload the emergency action plan into some type of web-based or even cloud-based type arrangement, and then they can access that through smartphones, through tablets, via a particular app. And with technology, some companies keep that in-house, and they store it on on the hard drive of the particular device, and then they can access it in an emergency situation. Some companies have even developed their own apps. It's a proprietary app that allows them to access this while they're there. Whatever your organization has the resources to provide, take advantage of that, because you're going to want to be able to access this plan once you've either A, evacuated, or B, you've sheltered in place. Again, I hope this video shed some light on best practices and considerations for evacuation, shelter in place, beyond the basic fundamentals that you're going to get looking at the OSHA literature or the broad guidelines and even a consensus standard like NFPA 1600. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out in the virtual office. Thank you.